Welcome to our adult class. We currently are in Revelation chapter 8, if you want to be turning there. Revelation chapter 8. Before we just jump right into the text, this morning, had some extra time. I got up early and read from this point on the rest of the book. And I want to caution us as we read through these next several chapters. It's almost like, well, here it says a third part of the vegetation was killed. Here's the third part of the sea, and then later a third part of men, and this and that. And in other words, it seemed like it's almost redundant as you go from chapter to chapter. But I think you need to remember something. Two things. First, this is a vision that John is seeing, and it's being revealed, laid out before him. And could God have brought judgment upon Rome instantly on one occasion? Certainly could. But I want you to read a passage, and you'll see this more than once. In Revelation 9:21, you don't have to turn there unless you want. I'll read it for you. Revelation 9, verse 21, neither repented they of their murders, nor of their sorcerers, nor of their fornication, nor of their thefts. All right, Revelation 16, verse 9. And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory. Chapter 16, verse 11. And blasphemed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores, and repented not of their deeds. Now, I brought those things up for this purpose. One of the reasons, in my view, that these gradual, seemingly at least, gradual judgments came upon Rome was to turn the people. When God decided he's going to destroy the world with a flood, Noah, did he immediately begin the rain to fall? No. No, the text says, that God waited while the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared. In 2 Peter, it even tells us that God was long-suffering, not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. So there was a time period, and if I interpret Genesis 6 properly, I think it was over 100 years while Noah built that ark, that Noah was also a preacher trying to turn the people. Unfortunately, no one believed his message, but God gave them opportunity. And even here with Rome, as I read that, and I thought, it's almost like this is being what I call drug out for longer than in my earthly mind that it needed to be. But then again, I'm not God. And I see these different events happening, and as I just read to you in chapter 9, chapter 16, and yet they repented not. But I think God was giving them opportunity as these different things, the plagues, these other problems that was beginning to be brought upon the Egyptians, not the Egyptians, I'm sorry, but the Roman nation, the city of Rome. I think God was giving them, wanting them, desiring them to repent. One more thing about this, and we'll go on. The book of Jonah. That was one of my favorite studies, or else, when I say story, I don't mean it was fictitious, but how Jonah was swallowed by the great fish and so on, spat upon the dry ground. God told him to go to Nineveh. He didn't want to go. When he finally went, it's rather clear that his attitude wasn't good as he went through the city crying out, yet 40 days and Nineveh shall be overthrown. I think he took a lot of pleasure in that. After his, if you want to call that preaching, what did he do? Does anyone remember what Jonah did after he preached? What did he do? He sat down and waited for what? Yeah, I can't wait to see it. And anyway, the book ends, and I'm paraphrasing this, I'm not quoting it, but the last couple, 3 verses, God points out to Jonah, listen, you have nothing to do with these people. And yet, here you are there, that many people are innocent, many people are ignorant, and that was basically the idea. And you want them to be destroyed instantly? Have you no mercy? And of course the people did repent at the preaching of Jonah. But here, I just think it's important for us to remember, as I said, God could have, in his infinite mercy, he didn't have to write the book of Revelation telling the Christians, listen, it's going to be all right. Christianity's not going to end. It's not going to be destroyed. He could have simply brought judgment upon Rome immediately. But he writes this book to tell the Christians, listen, you will not, in other words, it's not the end of Christianity. Rome is going to be judged. But he does that over, I think, a gradual time period. And I'm not talking about hundreds of years, obviously. But, again, his desire was for them to repent, to turn. I just wanted to bring that out here as we read this. All right, any thoughts about that before we go into the text itself?
It's the same way today, Nathan. Look how long suffering Christ is now.
Well, isn't that true?
Really?
I mean, you look at our world today and compared, and of course a lot of us are getting a little gray in the head, so to speak, but we're old enough to look back in our lifetime and see how things have changed so much. For those of you who have been members of Centerview for a long time, 30 years ago, how many empty seats would we have had here this morning? Well, we'd had some, sure.
Very little.
Yeah, very little. And come 10 o'clock, or 11 o'clock, I'm sorry, come 11 o'clock, you wouldn't have a horde of people come in. There might have been one or two. I worked, this happened, that happened. I mean, that's, it's life. Sunday night, I wouldn't be preaching to empty seats. There were many times back in the day when I preached there full time. It had nothing to do with me. It's the same with before me and even after me for a time period. But there were times we'd have more on Sunday night we'd have on Sunday morning. All right, it's not like that today. You look at just, and I know a lot of people have passed. Even since we've been here in this building, in this location, you think of all the many people. Tony had mentioned, I don't know if somebody had told him or maybe he'd counted up. I forget, and I'll miss it, I guess, if I tried to tell you what I think the number was. But it was several since we've been here. People who have died and yet not being replaced. Our children, our grandchildren are not being converted as they were 2 or 3 generations ago, or a couple generations ago, or whatever. So things have changed, Jimmy. That's true. And the morality of people in general, not just the concern for Christianity, but many things have changed. This past week, I started reading a book about the Restoration Movement, and I'll probably preach on that tonight. But I felt this interesting, or thought this interesting. And I'd never come across this, or if I did, with my mind, I might have forgotten it. But the way they constructed buildings back then was very different than today. And Danny, maybe you should have thought of this. It's your fault, Danny. But when they built a building, often, you know where the entrance would be? In our building, which is, it's common, it's customary, it's back there. The pulpit's up here. They put the entrance behind the pulpit. If you came in late, there's 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 100 people looking at you. What kind of incentive do you think that had for people to come late, or show up late?
You better get here early.
Talk about the walk of shame. There's grandma on the back just saying, that boy. And then again, leaving. That preacher's long-winded. I can't take it. So I'm going to leave. Where'd you have to walk past?
Everybody.
Yeah. And I just thought that was interesting, the way they constructed many buildings in the older days. And I'm talking about back in the 17, 1800s.
A lot of people can have a problem not making it on time, and we can't judge that person just because they come in late, because something could have happened.
But you're bringing up common sense. And that's exactly right. I know that.
And the thing about God, see, everything that goes on in
And God knows the heart. I'm simply saying there was a means or a reason why they did that, though, to, I guess, keep people honest or whatever. But surely you're right, okay? I mean, obviously, people become sick and so on, and no, we shouldn't judge them. I'm just bringing up an idea of how they constructed their buildings, at least many, and I thought it interesting. But nevertheless, things have changed. And we have, in general, I will think, gone downhill. You look at every congregation in our area. C Street has been the largest, is still the largest. But I went to their lectureship in November, and I sat there, and they don't have near the numbers they once had. At least that was my observation. That I went once or twice that night, or once I know. But and other congregations, and it's sad that it is as it is. But regardless, things have changed. But God is patient. He's long-suffering toward us. He's desiring that all mankind repent. And that included, I think, even Rome here, who was so persecuting the early church. Okay, let's pick up, and I appreciate you listening to me ramble. I hope it made sense. Because as we continue on, and yes, I'm going slow, but we see a lot of these things, you say, well, surely, a third part here, and a third part there, and a third part there, and we start doing math. Why is it not ended? Well, it's a vision. And I think he was bringing this upon them gradually. Anyway, let me start at verse 6. We've already read some of this and studied it. We're going to jump in, I guess, about verse 8. Revelation chapter 8, verse 6. And the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. The first angel sounded. There followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth. And the third part of the trees was burnt up, and all green grass was burnt up. And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers, and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many died of the waters, because they were made bitter. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. And I beheld, and I heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, by reason of the other voices of the trumpets of the 3 angels which are yet to sound. All right, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on this. We've already looked at some of this, unless you have something. We were already talked about the stars, verse 8 rather. The angel that sounded, the mountains burning with fire, cast in the sea. Third part became blood. Verse 9, the different creatures in the sea that had died. Third part of the ships destroyed. We talked about how it would have an effect on commerce. And I think that's the picture. Things were beginning to become very difficult for Rome financially. They were in a bind. Verse 10, the great star of heaven burning as it were of a lamp, a third part of the rivers upon the fountains of waters. Verse 11, it was called wormwood. Wormwood was something that was very bitter in nature, and I think it had just a general description, the vision that John saw. Things are getting difficult. And I think that's what it's being portrayed here as. We talked about the sun, part of it, verse 12, or we didn't, but we will. The third part of the moon, the stars were darkened. We can look back to the Old Testament, as we talked about last week, not only with earthquakes depicted as coming judgment, but so was the sun, so was the darkening of the sun, depicting God's judgment in coming. And then it ends in verse 13 with this angel flying through the midst of heaven and saying, Whoa, in other words, you think this is bad, you haven't seen anything yet. In essence, that's what he was saying. woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the three angels which are yet to sound. All right, that kind of sums up, I guess, as a whole, chapter 8. Any thoughts or comments before we go into chapter 9? Correct.
You can't get from it that it was chaos. Persecute Christians. Even Jews doing, all for it also. That the consequences of doing that, even as a society, when you start attacking people, start killing people, this is Nazi Germany. The world turns on you. You turn on yourself. I mean, it's just total chaos. And when the Bible says, my word is not returned to the Lord, and you see people violating the word of God with their own beard, as a culture, there's nothing that can come from that. And the time that comes, I guess really depends upon that culture. And, do they attack, do they kill abruptly? Because there's consequences. People start saying, well, what kind of people are we? Well, we just, put people on stakes and light them on fire. What kind of people would do that? And as a culture, you start thinking of part of the culture, then you turn against yourself. It's just chaos. When you read about it, it's like, it's affecting a third of the world. And it did, probably affect a third of the world. In all respects, water, land, sea, air, everything is being affected by the way the Romans were destroying the world. Their culture was destroying the world. And there were consequences because of this happened. Little by little.
It was stated once that the sun never sat on the Roman Empire. It was so large. And yes, the people, two things. The people were, in general, had gone, we talked about them becoming so decayed. They built the arenas for their own sport. What kind of sport was that? Was that rugby? Was that soccer? Was that football? What kind of sport was that? Yeah, it was blood. When we're talking about a blood sport, we're talking about to the death. It is said that they actually often would light Christians as fires to keep, we have these lights going. They didn't have, all these lights around the arena. That they would often bind up and place these Christians in tar. And when it became dark, that would be part of the entertainment, trying to light the lights. And then, they would light these men, of course, who would scream agonizing screams to the point of death, which hopefully came quickly. And then they would light until it would be extinguished. And I guess they'd light, so I don't know what else, but that's how they were getting their entertainment from these. The gladiators then would fight to the literal death, and seeing even part of that would be Christians as they would persecute them, tying ropes to their hands and their legs, and then have beasts of burden literally pull them apart as these people screamed in agony, and they sat in glee about that. But then, as Bobby said, which I think is very, very accurate, and something I really hadn't put in place, here was Rome is going to be persecuted, and this is brought upon Rome. But when the inhabitants of the nation began to suffer, do they turn upon gradually? Do they have a different view of the leadership? Well, sure, even in America. I mean, we're not to that extent. But if things aren't going well for us, then we're going to have a different view of Washington, okay? When inflation becomes so, and we can't, things are happening as we're not happy, yeah, we look to our leadership. So all this was beginning to rain down upon Rome. And again, John sees this, he's writing this, it's an encouragement to Christians that, listen, judgment is coming upon Rome. All right, thanks for listening to me and Bob ramble here. Let's go into chapter 9 then. And I want to read, we're not a good place to stop. I want to read the first 10 verses or so, and then we'll come back. Chapter 9, verse 1. And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it. They shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. And the shapes of the locusts were like unto horses prepared unto battle. And on their heads were as it were crowns like gold, and their faces were as the faces of men. And they had hair as the hair of women, and their teeth were as the teeth of lions. And they had breastplates as it were breastplates of iron. And the sound of their wings was as the sound of chariots of many horses running to battle. And they had tails like unto scorpions, and there were stings in their tails, and their power was to hurt men 5 months. Let's go ahead and get this next verse. And they had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue is Abaddon, but in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. All right, let's go back to verse 1 here, and if we get further in our notes, we'll certainly read on beyond that. Okay, again, I saw, the fifth angel sounded, and he said, I saw a star fall from heaven unto earth. To him was given the key of the bottomless pit. Now, what's a bottomless pit? All right, it has no bottom to it, does it? It's no end. And I think it should be obvious to us. It's a description that should be interpreted symbolically. I don't think it was meant to be literal in its concept, but whatever reason, the Bible says here was an angel that sounded, a star fell from heaven, to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. In other words, this being was given this key, and verse 2, he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose smoke out of the pit as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. So just what John has revealed to us in this vision thus far, we see a star falls from heaven. It's obviously not a star like we would think of a star, which would be nothing more than what? A rock in essence. But it's a being. Later on, the last verse we read tells us more about that being. I'll jump ahead and say I don't believe it is Satan. I'll give you my reasons why. We'll define those words in a moment when we get down to verse 11 or 12. But nevertheless, he opens this bottomless pit. What comes out of the pit? Smoke. And it's so great that it literally, the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. It appears, at least the way I envision this, that John saw it, and it's almost like it's blocking out the sun. We have all witnessed a great fire from time to time. Tragically, maybe it's a home burning, but in these mountains, sometimes we have the hills and the valleys. Sometimes you see this terrible smoke arising. It's black, it's dark, and what do we think? Yeah, that's often what I think. Now, if it's white smoke, well, maybe they're burning trees or vegetation, stuff they've cut down. But when it's black and it's dark and it's, we think of something tragic happening. And I think that's what he saw here. This smoke of a great furnace coming up. All right, verse 1 and 2, any thoughts that you might have if you want to interject before we go further? What's it depicting? What's going to happen? Verse 3. There came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power. Now, I think that's important. Was given power as the scorpions of the earth have power. All right, now, we didn't read it. I guess we should have just read the whole chapter here. But who are these locusts, and we've read the description. Who are they bringing problems to? God's people? No. Oh, if we keep reading, we will. Those people who were not sealed by God. Remember earlier in the book, he talked about God had sealed his servants In other words, not in a literal sense, but like, and we talked about if I had a book or something, that I would write my name in the book, and that book represents that name ownership. In other words, it's coming from my library, so to speak. Well, God knows his own people. We talked about that a couple chapters ago. And these locusts that are going to come, they're not coming to affect God's people, but the enemies of God. All right? So I think that's important here on the onset. And how he has these, what John sees, it had to bring fear to the heart of men. The way John described this, tell me some of the descriptions of these locusts.
Sting like a scorpion.
All right? Sure, that's one of them. Verse 7, they were like horses. How big's a locust when we think about a locust? All right, and I'm sure from what I've read, have you ever heard, you know John the Baptist? He came in the likeness of Elijah. His meat was like locusts and wild honey. In the Middle East, I'm told that locusts could be up 3 or 4 inches or long. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Middle East or seen one, but what I'm getting, we're not talking about something that just, no, these are like horses. Jimmy said, and correctly so, verse 10, they had tails like scorpions. There were stings in their tails. Look at some of the other descriptions, though. Verse 7 had heads what did their heads look like? Like men. They had crowns like, didn't say were gold, but crowns like gold. Faces as it were the heads of men. Hair as if it were women. Longer hair. And I don't know the significance of that. And I'm being honest, help me. Anyone have an idea of what the significance? And again, God's painting this terrible, horrific picture. Here are locusts, like horses, tails, that sting, and they have these crowns on them, and they're going to have teeth like lion, but they have hair like women. Now, I'm being serious.
I think it's a composite maybe of many features that were adored by that Roman hierarchy. The power of the teeth of the lion, the beauty of the woman, the crown representing their power, this sort of thing maybe.
Ah, that's good. And they had on breastplates of iron, verse 9. They had breastplates as it were, was breastplates of iron. They had wings. Horses run. No, these had wings. And the sound was of chariots of many horses running to battle. And it's a terrible sight to foresaw, to have seen, I guess I could say. When I was doing a little prep for the class, I came across this, and do you know, anyone know anything about locusts as far as how destructive they can be? Here in East Tennessee, I don't know that we've ever seen such, but in the Middle East, I'm convinced these people were familiar with locusts to the point, and they knew how destructive they could be. Well, let me read to you, and I'm going to give you the background here. This is a commentary that Howard Winters wrote, Clayton's brother. He quotes this fellow. It's not Howard saying this. He's quoting this gentleman, Dr. William Thomas. He spent 45 years as a missionary in the Bible lands. Okay? Here's what he wrote. He witnessed this. It is somewhat of a lengthy reading, but it's horrific. I had no idea that locusts could be that problematic in the Middle East. Here's what he wrote. Early in the spring, the locusts appeared in considerable numbers along the sea coast and the lower spurs of the mountains. They did no great injury at the time, and having laid their eggs, now these were locusts that, as they developed, could fly. But he says, let me go back, and having laid their eggs, immediately disappeared. The people, familiar with their habits, looked with anxiety to the time when those eggs would be hatched, nor were their fears groundless or exaggerated. For several days previous to the 1st of June, we had heard that thousands of young locusts were on their march up the valley towards our village, and at length I was told that they had reached the lower part of it. Summoning all the people I could collect, we went to meet and attack them, hoping to stop their progress altogether, or at least turn aside the line of their march. Now, let me explain something. He'll talk about this later, but when these insects first hatch, they don't have wings. They can't fly. They're not mature. Okay? They're like, as he's going to describe, they're like grasshoppers in essence. Okay, let me pick it up here. Never shall I lose the impression produced by the first view of them. I had often passed through clouds of flying locusts, but these we now confronted were without wings and about the size of a full-grown grasshopper, which they closely resembled in appearance and behavior. But their number was astounding. The whole face of the mountain was black with them, and on they came like a disciplined army. We dug trenches and kindled fires and beat and burnt to death heaps upon heaps. But the effort was utterly useless. They charged up the mountainside and climbed over rocks, walls, ditches, and hedges. Those behind covering up passed over the masses already killed. After a long and I don't know, I can't read or talk. He was tired, okay? After a long and fatiguing contest, I descended the mountain to examine the length of the column, but could not see the end of it. Wearied by my hard-fought battle with the devastating host, I returned and gave over the vain effort to stop its progress for that day. By the next morning, the head of the column had reached my garden, and, hiring 8 or 10 people, I resolved to rescue at least my flowers and vegetables. During the day, we succeeded by fire and by beating the locusts off the wall and bushes and branches and keeping our little garden tolerably clear of them. But it was appalling to watch that irresistible army as it marched up the road, ascending the hill and above my house. At length, worn out with incessant skirmishing, I gave up the contest. Carrying the pots into the house, covering up what else I could, I surrendered the remaining to the conquerors. For 4 days they continued to pass on toward the east, until finally only a few stragglers of the mighty host were left behind. In every stage of their existence, the locusts gave a most impressive view of the power of God to punish a wicked world. Observe the pioneers of the host, those flying squadrons that appeared in early spring. No power of man could interrupt them. Thousands on thousands, with the most fatal industry, deposit their innumerable eggs in the fields, the plains, and the deserts. This done, they vanished like morning mist. But in 6 or 8 weeks, that very dust seems to have awakened into life and begins to creep. Some of the animated earth becomes minute grasshoppers, creeping and jumping, all in the same direction. They begin their destructive progress. While they march on, they consume every green thing and every wonderful with eagerness and expedition. A large vineyard and vegetable garden adjoining ours was as green as a meadow in the morning, but long before night it was as bare as a newly plowed field or dusty road. The noise made by them in marching and foraging was like that of a heavy shower falling on a distant forest. Imagine an animal, and I'm talking the size of a grasshopper, eating, and it sounded like a rain in a heavy forest. Okay, if you lived in the Middle East, you would have had some knowledge of the locusts, their behaviors. Now, when John sees this, and he talks about locusts like horses, and they have scorpions, and their tails are like scorpions. They have on breastplates. You can't just burn these guys. You can't just stomp on. I mean, you can imagine the fear it would have brought upon the Israel. It would have brought upon the people, and this was God's judgment. Don't look back in history and say, well, now let's try to figure out exactly how the locusts came. No, this is a vision. It's not meant to be taken literally. But I do believe The division was, it was the most horrendous picture he could paint. How can I describe this judgment? It's not going to be good. Let's make it like locusts. They know about locusts. Let's make it like horses. Horses they used in battle. Let's put them on breastplates. Let's give them teeth like lions. Oh yeah, let's put them scorpion tails. I mean, again, everything depicted here was to bring fear. Yes. I'm going to have to get braids. Let my hair grow. I'll be tired. All right, perhaps that would, I don't know. Yeah, it's a good example of any, I guess, unless someone has something better. That may have been something to do. But that's what he saw. That was the vision. And you can imagine Christians reading this saying, well, God is going to judge them. This is, there is hope for us. Yeah, righteousness exalteth the nation, sin is reproach to any people. If you had been living there and you look at Rome to the individual, to you or to I, we would look at Rome and say, oh, it's sorry, look how mighty they are. I mean, that they're going to fall? Yeah. God's going to bring them down. How is that going to happen? And then he begins to see these visions. And I'm sure even, as I said, to the Christian who are familiar with the locusts, and then he puts all this together, whoa. All right? They don't know who they're messing with here. This is the God of heaven and earth. But the torment that would be brought upon them were terrible in nature. And verse 6 says, in those days shall men seek death and shall not find it. They shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. There are some things worse than death. And, the problems, the difficulties they were going to go through, it wasn't going to be pleasant. Okay? And that is what's depicted here in this judgment. It's all about judgment. Don't expect, well, here the Chinese are going to come and this is going to be fulfilled here and this later, this atomic blast, and this. That's not the idea.
It's almost like there's a self-made creature. When you think about the characteristics of breastplate, iron, the steam, the power, the hair, of the Roman women. It's almost like it's a self-made creature. But God brought that about. You brought it on yourself.
It's bringing all the worst together.
You brought it on yourself. Everything that's happening to you, this is the beast that you created.
And this is only the first one. There's more to come here. But that's what he sees. And as I said, picture yourself there in the first century. Well, it's impossible. No, it's not impossible. Okay. Verse 11, let me make a comment or two here because I said I didn't think personally this is Satan. Number one, who was this as they opened this key to the bottomless pit and out comes these locusts, which we've already described. Who are they bringing judgment to? Rome. Remember when Jesus in the first century, when questioned, they were accusing, you're doing these miracles with the power of Satan. And Jesus says, no. In essence, he says, if Satan is going to destroy his own house, how can it stand? See what I'm saying? I don't think this is Satan here, even though in verse 9, let's define some terms. They had a king over them, which is the angel of the bottomless pit, whose name in the Hebrew tongue was Abaddon. What does Abaddon mean? Let me read the definition here. According to Strong's, it's a destroying angel. Thayer says the word Abaddon means destruction. He even goes on to say the name of the angel prince of the internal regions, the minister of death, the author of havoc on the earth, place of destruction. So what I mean is I don't think we necessarily must conclude that's Satan But he says, in the Greek tongue hath his name Apollyon. And that word means, in essence, the same thing. But let me read you the definition. A destroyer. Thayer says, the angel of the bottomless pit, the destroyer. I'll give you more of my reasons why, but that's basically why I don't think this is Satan, at least at this time. Any comments you have as we conclude, as classes come up? All right, I appreciate you listening and getting involved in the class. Lord willing, we'll pick it up at verse 13, verse 12 next week.